Our first speaker in the panel discussion is Matthew Harris, Canadian Patriot Review and the Chief Research Specialist in the Institute in Moscow. And Matthew will speak on the systemic approach to science and the growth of humanity. The floor is yours, Matthew.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this illustrious event. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. Circumstances arose that didn't make it happen, but I'm very overjoyed to be able to speak and share some ideas. It is too rare, I think, in society and especially in our world that we have the opportunity to think deep into the future, let alone 100 years or more into the future. But that's really what humanity is all about. Other species that we see, they are wonderful. They are genetically endowed to adapt, to thrive in nature. Humanity alone generates concepts beyond the boundary conditions of our life, both before our birth and after our deaths. And we are able to, if we so choose, to pursue concepts that give meaning and shape our free will, our choices, our priorities in the course of our lives, such that we can leave something better for the future generations. So I was very, very moved by what Vladislav Leonov had also said a few presentations back regarding the idea of love. And I'd like to just pay homage to that idea that when pursuing problem-solving measures that go beyond our lifetime, one of the most important things to remind ourselves is that we do this with all humility and with love for humanity, and with a real concept to always put humanity and the potential beauty of humanity, even though we sometimes see human beings acting in not so great ways, but we always put that potential in the forefront. And today we have a world where, I mean, a billion people today live with no electricity. We have nearly a billion who have no clean water. With 15 million children die approximately every day from unnecessary starvation. So these are some of the problems. There's many others that we are confronted with. And so I would like to present and open up my presentation with a little bit of a screen share. Let me just do that right now.
Little bit screen share.
Okay. All right, I imagine people can see my screen. I've chosen to title my presentation Open versus Closed Systems, the Growth Needs of Humanity in the 21st Century and Beyond. The picture is a beautiful picture of the Earth from space, featuring some incredible noetic powers of the technosphere, some have called it, that have spread themselves around through electrical development and civilization, especially in the last 150 or so years. The question that I want to pose, and this shapes how we think about the future, because if we don't define our system, our biosphere, the human sphere that evolved within the biosphere as a part of nature, if we don't take the time to really evaluate what are those things that we're trying to shape and help, then we might think about the future in ways that actually could inadvertently do more harm to both of those elements. So there are two possible hypotheses when approaching systems. One is that the Earth is a closed system in a vacuum of cold space, separated by empty space between stars, within a galaxy. And that the biosphere is a self-contained thing localized into this one region, this sweet spot of the solar system, just as humanity is, and that we have to just adapt to this closed system of finiteness, no matter what. The opposing open system orientation tends to think of this as even though our eyes don't perceive it, something which both the biosphere and human civilization are interfacing directly with an ocean of cosmic radiation, electromagnetic fields, densely packed. There's no concept of empty space within that mode. Just to quickly point out some of the characteristics, and I think this is just useful just before we start looking at some case studies of ideas, of policies going forward into the next century. Open systems have certain characteristics. They're non-zero sum. The whole is always more than the sum of their parts. There's relative limits to growth. The idea is that if you have at any phase a certain limit of how much you can sustain as a species, then that can be variable based upon the discoveries you make or fail to make. So those boundary conditions, sometimes called carrying capacity, are changeable in those regards. Politically speaking, there's an orientation towards win-win. That's supposed to say cooperation, not competition, but a cooperative approach to working with your partners, with your fellow humans and nation states in cooperative projects that benefit all participants. There's not an idea of battling for scarcity. It's rather to create abundance through cooperation, which creates interconnectivity, enhances peaceful opportunities for dialogue and mutual trust. It is ultimately politically multipolar. There's multiple centers of gravity, not just one hegemonic imposition of a unipolar center of gravity. Inversely, we have closed systems, which are pretty much the opposite in many ways. They're zero sum. The whole is the sum of the parts that are available. What exists now are essentially all that could exist. And so there's always an idea of a diminishing amount of returns over a time function. There's absolute limits to growth in that orientation as well. You also have an idea of a win-lose competition focus, unfortunately, when it comes to the application geopolitically of problems regarding who's a winner, who's a loser. It's unipolar, as I mentioned earlier. So one problem, and some people don't see this as a problem, I think it is a problem. Over the past 60 or so years, especially since the early 70s, what we once had as a industrial force in the West, a industrial productive force, the high machine tool capacity, which is a center where creative thought and ingenuity is, that used to be very thriving. 40% or so of the output in Western nations was made up until the early 70s by the industrial sector. The services and the agriculture are also charted here, and something happened in the early 70s where we began to see a massive increased rate of decline, an outsourcing of industries. And some people say, well, that's the third way manufacturing to poorer countries for cheap market exports to our dollaramas. I would say that that's not actually natural. And that in fact, it has hurt and crippled many nations, because if today we wish to, repair our structure, we would not be in a very good place to do it, as we've discovered recently that over $4 trillion would be needed just to bring North American infrastructure to safety standards, due to primarily just neglect. And if we wanted to build many of the things, we have the productive base anymore. The Rust Belt in Detroit is one of. So I wanted to showcase one person who doesn't think in zero-sum ways. And Xi Jinping gave a speech in 2016 describing coordinated development as the unity of balanced development and imbalanced development. The process from balance to imbalance and then to rebalance is the basic law of development. Balance is relative, while imbalance is absolute. Emphasizing coordinated development is not pursuing equalitarianism, but giving more importance to equal opportunities and balanced resource allocation. So what we have here is an idea of sustainable development that's very different from how some people think about it. But this idea that there is always a coexistence of states of stability, of no change, as well as of change, that's always there. With every new technology, there's a new set of relationships, a new set of consumer production capabilities that happen as you introduce, let's say, electricity into a system. And there's a certain stability that happens when you have that. But then obviously, if you introduce new technologies, there's going to be more disruptions. And that imbalance is a fact of life. The question then is, which is primary, which leads in the dance and which follows? And what Xi Jinping is just stating there simply is that the idea of the balance is a relative function, and that he is positing that it is the imbalance which is absolute. That's the ongoing necessity. And I think we're going to look at some examples, but pulling out a billion people from poverty over the past 2 decades is quite the accomplishment. We're going to see a little bit more on that in a second. Inversely, people who don't think this way, we've seen expressed in what is commonly understood as what was called the Malthusian way of thinking. The Malthusian revival was something that revived itself in the early 70s under the 1972 limits to growth that took the old formula, a mathematical formula of geometric populations growing while food production grows merely arithmetically. And that is something which certain people were able to forecast as a linear trend extrapolated into the future as causing a crisis point that could be mitigated by population control measures and other things. That was Thomas Malthus. The revival of that way of thinking in the early 70s, which really took off in many ways, simply used more complex computer modeling observed, which plotted more variables, population being one of them, pollution being another, and simply charted that within 50 or 60 years, a new population crisis could be forecast based on the existing technologies, and that ultimately problems had to be solved. But ultimately, I think that one falls more into the closed system mode of thinking. I don't want to say too much about this, but an open system thinker that I think I'm speaking to an audience in Russia, former president of the Russian Academy of Science, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, who's also the founder of the Ukrainian Academy of Science, is a wonderful thinker whose ideas of biogeochemistry are very valuable. He essentially created a new branch of thought that involves understanding the existence, the coexistence of these three phase spaces that always coexist: the non-living, the living, and the noetic, as three coexisting spheres. Basically, in short, carbon atoms or nitrogen atoms that exist in the lithosphere operate in a different space-time in Vernadsky's understanding. Their cycles will be very slow relative to the atomic behavior or molecules, the same molecules or the same atoms that are found in plants or your body, your flesh, which cycle more times through the biosphere. They play a different role, a different purpose, and there's different principles at play, but they both coexist. Now, the noosphere, sometimes called the technosphere, is yet another higher state that we see with the use of, let's say, thorium that takes a place all of a sudden for the first time in energy production. So its role is very different, where human thought is the driving force. Infrastructure, and that's what you could see there as the electrical grids of a continent are an expression of that noosphere. Vernadsky, I'm not going to read this quote, but the point is, in his writing of the Biosphere in 1928, he characterized the biosphere not as a closed, but rather as a system that interfaces with the interplanetary and interstellar medium of cosmic radiation, mediated by nested magnetic fields, which evolved over time. Things like the ozone layer is the effect itself of free oxygen produced by photosynthesis. And so you have a tuning in that sense of life, helping future states of life organize in an oriented way to fulfill certain functions. Vernadsky didn't get too metaphysical, but it does lead you in a certain theological orientation in some ways. Obviously, there's also the issue of cataclysmic events that periodically happen, wiping out a lot of species, being it the fact that the human species is the first one to be able to contemplate the nature of these cataclysms, whether it's from solar flare inducement or from cosmic radiation or from asteroids or volcanism, all of which seem to have intergalactic or galactic, at least, effects or causes. We haven't discovered very much of this yet. Does lead one to think that perhaps we are the first species capable of avoiding a mass extinction, both for ourselves and for the biosphere. So that's just a few words on theory. As a case study, I just want to look at 3 brief case studies, and then we can open up for questions. The Arctic has long been known as an uninhabitable domain. Not a lot of life, cold desert. It's not a bad thing. But at the same time, the ice caps are receding, and we do see a new interest in the opportunities both for resources that are needed for the development needs of humanity, but also shipping. Just quickly as a segue, the current Belt and Road Initiative, it began merging increasingly with the Eurasian Economic Union led by Russia in 2015. It's increasingly taken many steps of integration. About 135 or so nations are taking part already, spread as we see an east-west corridor, but there's many branches in Africa, South America, and beyond, especially through the Middle East. Activity again involve the creation of new industrial corridors. Something like 50 new advanced cities have been created by China in recent years, and many more to come. There's branches up throughout Russia, which is very synergistic with the current Russian program for developing the Arctic and Eastern regions. Now, in 2018, it was unveiled that China and Russia together had moved towards a polar Silk Road to increase add the Arctic passageway as a new maritime shipping route from China and other Asian countries to Europe, which would cut something like 5,000 nautical miles. I think it's something like 7 or 8 days of sea transit would be cut off, but Russia also has committed to quintupling the flow of shipping throughout that region too. It's a game changer in many ways, and it involves also the building of rails, the great longitudinal rail. Many new industrial corridors are being invested in. It's a factor. It's a real factor in the world. So just to say that that's there, and it also helps alleviate the congestion of the Straits of Malacca, the Suez Canal, which are very congested. So that's a reality, and increasingly there's more and more discussion. We're seeing it's getting on board, Japan getting on board with investments into the Arctic regions, which involve cooperating with China, which is very important to establish peaceful trust over time, and rail and roads being built up. There's a project close to my heart that Russia first announced as an interest in 2007, and again reemphasized. This is Business Insider, to build the Bering Strait Rail Tunnel, to extend rail through a $60 billion effort through either tunnels or bridge, mostly a tunnel, through the Bering Strait, connecting the continents of the Americas and Eurasia. This is something which didn't get a lot of traction, but the point is, it is a potentiality to not only help the West revive its lost manufacturing capabilities and long-term thinking, which we once enjoyed, but that's been long gone. This is not a new idea either. I've written many books about this, but this is an old map from 1890 featuring the World Land Bridge with Bering Strait in the middle. That was drafted by Abraham Lincoln's ally, the first governor of Colorado, William Gilpin, who had many contacts in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, even, I was surprised to find, had even hired American engineers to conduct feasibility studies in 1906. Unfortunately, some things got in the way. That didn't happen. It was again revived as a discussion between American and Russian diplomats during World War II. But again, the Cold War got in the way, and that discussion disappeared. However, there was a renewed focus throughout the 1950s because of these discussions to open up the Arctic for industrial development and also scientific development as well. One of the key figures who played a very active role in this was a Canadian. I'm here in Canada, so this was an interesting discovery to me. John Diefenbaker, who became prime minister around the same time that John F. Kennedy was also leader inside of the United States. And Diefenbaker actually issued $73 million to begin feasibility studies to build a new prototype city called Frobisher Bay in today's Nunavut as a dome city powered by nuclear reactors, or one nuclear reactor per city, that would house about 5,000 people plus their families as workers, scientists, exploring cosmic radiation. Something like 30% of the raw materials that are untapped are available. These are some estimates. I mean, it could be much more, could be less. I don't even know. But the point is, they would be housed in this complex that involves recreational activities with all of the amenities of modern day Toronto, greenhouses, you name it, and different connecting transportation grids. So this was going to be one of dozens. Unfortunately, certain credit crises and other crises disrupted that. But the point is, back to the future in some ways. I think some of these ideas that were being entertained in a serious way in the past are very much worth revisiting. There was a recent effort by Russia, which has not gone forward that much in more recent years, in the city of Umka, due to a variety of factors, but still, the amount of new discoveries in science of cosmic rays, how they influence the biosphere, weather systems, could only be explored if you have serious work in the north. The other aspect that I think in today's world is very valuable, with Afghanistan's issues being what they are, Syria, other places, the Middle East is a very high point of interest. Again, going back to that same image, these rail lines, China, keep in mind, has had 35,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. In North America, we have hardly anything at all. Canada has 0. And they're planning on doubling that within the next 15 or so years. These rail lines involve also conventional that move through the Middle East. Many places in Africa are building all sorts of varieties of infrastructure, but also educational centers too, to train new generations of Nigerian and local engineers to carry this work forward. So it's not simply about imposing from the outside. There is a different orientation we haven't seen in a long time. There are currently discussions underway to begin building rail and roads through the Wakhan corridor and other areas in Afghanistan through that connect to Pakistan, but also through Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, the revival of the port of Latakia, and other ports of Tartarus and others in these regions that desperately need it. Jordan is among them. To reevaluate, comparing that to the more unipolar closed system thinking that has been more active in that region in recent years, I couldn't help it. I had to pull up this image just to dramatically make the point. The before and after these nations were helped, either Iraq, Libya, Yemen, or Syria, is just showcases a world of bad thinking, strange bad thinking that animated something which, I mean, it's terrible. So again, these are just a variety of things that are being revived. There's other synergistic policies like the 5Cs grand strategy that was once promoted by Bashar al-Assad, which involved 11 countries signing memoranda of understanding to build rail, build new industrial centers along these corridors connecting the 5 major water systems, which again there's a new discussion to revive this once more now that there's a hope for Syria. And China is entering with other partners in reconstructing potentially this destroyed zone. So just to say that. Cynthia had earlier gone through a few examples, but just to say China's Great Move South Water North project is one of the greatest water programs in history. The 3rd phase will be completed by 2050, and it is showcasing what can be done if we have a long-term patient view of things. There are programs for Jordan, for the Sinai Peninsula to do similar things. This is a program developed by a Dutch firm named Weathermakers by Van der Hoeven. Wonderful concepts are available there that involved different means of tackling and reviving the once green regions. These all used to be green regions, including the Sahara Desert. This is one example of the lowest plates that Cynthia had shown between 2007 and the present, and how quickly we found that the region recovered its once lush green natural state. It had been overfarmed once upon a time. And again, as Gaddafi had made the point during his efforts to build the great man-made water system, the biggest freshwater systems in the world are located under the Sahara Desert. About 5,000 years ago, these were above the desert. It was very green. There's a lot of evidence for that. For whatever reason, we don't know the reason, a lot of this water has gone under. And so there are programs that have been available on the books for a long time to bring some of that water up, also to desalinate water from salty zones, to create new reservoirs, to create diversion of water, as we saw with the building of Lake Chad, as Cynthia went through, and as well as ionospheric protocols too, which could divert atmospheric river systems so that the water cycling doesn't simply happen over the oceans, with each water molecule simply going back into the ocean, but rather is diverted so that the precipitation from the evaporation from oceans moves instead over ground that would sustain biodiversity before, and cycling through the biodiverse cycle for a few times before exiting back into the river systems and thus into the ocean. So you're basically increasing, as Vernadsky had made the point, the biogenic migration of atoms over time. Last case study, space. I'll just say a couple of quick items here. All of these things, which would in time, if we're thinking transgenerationally and being patient, not trying to force nature to obey our ivory tower formulas, but really taking the time to understand nature's invisible laws and working with the flow of nature, kind of like you do with Aikido. You work with the opponent's own motion. You don't try to force yourself unnaturally against your opponent. I'm not trying to say that nature is the opponent, but it's a metaphor. We could take some of these discoveries and insights along the way for terraforming in the long term places like Mars or other planetary bodies, perhaps around Jupiter, like Io or Europa or beyond, Titan. There's so many things to explore. There's hundreds of satellites in our solar system, or different things that a lot of discoveries to be made. It's exciting. So, these are just some examples of some of the recent activity regarding the China Zhurong Mars rover that just recently landed and is carrying out its last study on Mars's surface. You have Curiosity there landing, but you also have Perseverance and many other discussions for international cooperation. This involves things like potentially asteroid defense. That's something that's in the collective interest, to redirect perhaps some of these destructive weapons into, keeping humanity and the biosphere alive instead of destroying ourselves under a thermonuclear war. That's always nice. The point of the International Space Station as reviving the spirit of Apollo-Soyuz from the 1970s is a very interesting thing. And even though there's been missteps in recent years, I think that this is something that needs to be seen as sacred, preserved. We have astronauts from all over the world in the ISS working together. It's unfortunate that China has not been permitted to participate, but they have been working increasingly to build a new space station. Soon China will be the only country with a planned space station. And also they've got a program to work with Russia to build a lunar base on the surface of the moon. This is tied to a helium-3 orientation, mining the moon, mining asteroids, other things that involve new technologies, new ways of thinking about physics, matter, physical space-time, which have to be conceptualized if you're going to mine a place like the moon. You need things like the fusion torch, as Cynthia went through. That's a quick little beautiful painting of one potential future as a moon colony with some what appears to be greenhouses and other things that I just enjoyed. So with that, that's the end of my very brief presentation. If there's time for questions, I'm all yours.
Maybe someone has just one question. Good afternoon. I'm Artem Rudkovsky. I live in Belgium and Luxembourg. And my question is, you have shown many projects on reforming of areas that have been either damaged or that have never had greenery. This is all well, but maybe this is of course positive, but hypothetically, can it become negative?
Yes, it can, but that's why I'm saying it's very important to adopt a method where we do not skip steps, but we take the time to understand the processes of nature rather than do things like, for example, clear cutting an Amazon rainforest to translate resources into money. That's not good. That could have been thought through a lot better. And I think anytime you're about to make a big change could be done for good or for bad, depending on the level of awareness, understanding, or ignorance that is active in the action. So yes, you could certainly do great harm. Yes, to answer your question briefly.
Does this mean that China will need sometimes to slow down because some of its projects aim at the image of China internationally, and they may at some point ignore danger and do things without looking at potential signs that will show that this does not need to be done?
Well, I'm not one to speak for China. I mean, I do think though that certainly patience is vital. The role and the way generally of thinking about making big changes, like I mentioned, the Move South Water North project is a huge project. There are missteps along the way. The question is, I think, are you willing to be humble enough to learn from your missteps as you experiment? Or are you just fixed on the formula? Are you set with like, we're going to do it this way, no matter what happens? And that's something which we've seen contaminate human activity far too many times over the years. I think I've seen so far a quality of being able to adjust to error and correct errors in a very efficient way from the Chinese planners, from the engineers and other people who have been collectively working on a lot of these projects. And I applaud that. Of course, can things always be done better? Certainly. But I think that compared to the type of stagnant, entropic activity that has been dominant amongst Western societies for decades, where we just stopped. I mean, if you look at the investments into things like the space program in NASA, it seized up. It was completely slashed after 1966. And it went down ever since as far as per capita of GDP. Investments into fusion power, other things have been really seized up as well. There were many different pathways towards fusion being explored and invested in massively in the 60s and into the 70s, and that all was drained away. Building big projects sort of stopped, and we went into more of a stasis of consumerism. So I think that that's at least going outside of your boundary conditions to experiment with the purpose of uplifting people out of poverty is very, very much more important than doing nothing and just waiting for, the natural decay of nature to do its work, which hurts a lot of people.